Hello class, good afternoon. Uh, let's talk about a new topic for today. It is about global demographics and immigration. So in the past 50 years, the world has accelerated its transition out of long-term demographic stability. So in other words, there has been a great change when it comes to the demography of the whole world. So with the decline of infant and child mortality rates, the population saw population increase dramatically. So in other words, there was a great increase in population due to the decline. When we say decline class, that is the decrease of both infant and child mortality rates. So when you say decline, that is the decrease. When you say mortality rate, that is the death rate. So there was less infant and child death rates. Eventually, this led to lower fertility rates, but the population continues to increase due to population momentum. So when you say lower fertility rates, there are overall less pregnancies. So there are less number of people getting pregnant in other countries, but the population is still continuing to increase because of its momentum. So in other words, because there was such an increase, overall it will be a long time before it stops growing. So as per this image, you can see there is quite the big boom or increase in the population. So here in the 1950s, there was around 2 billion or more or less 2 billion people. By the year 2050 class, there will be almost 8.5 billion people in the world. As you can also see, this lower area, those are occupied by the more developed regions, and the higher one is occupied by the less developed regions. So the less developed regions experience much greater increase in their population. So these changes transformed age structures, resulting in the creation of the baby boom generation. So this is the generation that occurred when the world experienced the increase in its population. However, nowadays, the baby boom generation is experiencing aging already. So the aging of this generation and continued decline in fertility and old age mortality are shifting the population balance in developed countries from young to old. In other words, because there is a decrease in fertility rates and the old age mortality, they are both decreasing, those populations which are aging will become greater. Since there is less fertility, meaning there's not enough young people, and there's old age mortality. In other words, the old people are not dying as much. It means the population is becoming older, especially in developed countries. In developing countries, however, we are experiencing population explosion, the result of better nutrition, public health, infrastructure, and medical care. So in contrast to developed countries which is having an aging population, we are experiencing a population explosion of younger people. So what are the effects of population change on our economy or on economies in general? So economic development is affected by these population changes. Increasing population of the elderly can cause a drag on economic growth, where smaller populations must provide for the larger number of non-working dependents. So if the population that is aged higher than 60 grows too much, it can have a negative effect or a drag on the economy, especially on the working class or the working population. Rising life expectancy can also bolster an economy by creating greater incentive to save and invest in education, boosting the financial capital on which investors draw and the human capital that strengthens economies. So if there is an increase in life expectancy, you can also see that the people will have greater incentive to invest in education. Let's say you can live to up to 60 to 70 to 80 years old. There is a greater incentive that you have a better education for your children in order for them to have a better life. Countries which are able to absorb the baby boom generation into productive employment can experience a rapid increase in economic growth. So again, when those baby boom generation are starting to become 60 or above, they are already in the old age, if they are still capable of having a productive employment, in other words, they are still working, even if they are already 60 and above, we can expect that those economies can have economic growth. So they will not experience that slump if those aging population would just become dependent. If they are still working, they would still contribute to the population growth. However, if they are unable to take advantage, they are at a risk to create a large, chronically underemployed, and restive working age population. So that commonly happens in developing countries where there is not that much opportunity for those above 60. We have more opportunities for those below 60 to have employment. So as you can see, a larger population of aging population can have a drag or can create a drag on the economy or economic growth. So let's look at some trends and patterns of the global demographics. So global population, which was only 2 billion in 1950, is now over 6.5 billion today. I think it's already approaching 7 to 7.5 billion. The world is gaining around 76 million each year through this growth, though this growth is slowing. So this 76 million eventually will continue to go smaller, but our population will eventually reach 9 billion by 2050. So population growth is unevenly distributed, with 95% happening in developing countries. So when you divide the world between the developed and developing countries, almost 95% of all of that population growth is occurring only in those developing countries. So a reminder, when you say developing countries, we're talking about countries like the Philippines, countries in Asia, countries in Africa, and countries in South America. At least 50 of the least developed countries are expected to double by the middle of this century, so around 2050, or some of them can even triple their population. This is in contrast with developed countries or nations whose population remains steady at 1.2 billion. So that developed countries, their populations more or less remain the same. So they have very little growth. So why is there disparity between developed and developing countries? This is due to the heterogeneity in birth, death, and migration patterns. When you say heterogeneity, there is a difference. So there is a big difference between developed and developing countries when it comes to birth, death, and migration patterns. This often leads to changes in age group compositions of populations. So when you say age group, those are the 15 to 20 years old, 20 to 25, those are what you call age groups, 60 and above. One of the simplest ways to show population growth is the crude birth and death rates. When you say crude birth, that is how many people are born, and when you say death rate, that's how many people die per year. Both developed and developing experience a reduction of childbirths by about half over the past 50 years. So both developed and developing countries experience lowered birth rates. The rapid reduction of mortality rate, in other words, rapid reduction of death rates, have been experienced by developing countries since 1950s, while mortality rates in developed countries have been slowly increasing due to the large aging population. So there's a difference between the developed and developing. Developing countries are experiencing a lowered mortality rate, while developed countries, those which are already rich countries like USA, European countries, Japan, they are slowly increasing their mortality rate because their population is becoming aging. Such a trend will be experienced eventually by developing countries as well in the coming decades. So we will also experience that slowly increasing mortality rate because our population is also aging as well. So let's talk about infant and child mortality rates. So infant and child mortality rates in developing countries have been on the decline in the past 50 years. Infant mortality, that which is below 1 at the age of 1, in those countries were reduced from 180 to 57 deaths per 1,000 live births. this is predicted to decline further to 30 deaths per 1,000 live births. So you can see the pattern is that all infant deaths are decreasing. So there are less infant deaths per 1,000 live births in a year. This is due to improvements in nutrition, public health, in relation to water and sanitation, medical advances like vaccines and antibiotics. So that is the main reason why we are experiencing the decline of infant and or child mortality rates. So in developed countries, however, this infant mortality rate has always been lower, 59 to 7 per 1,000 live births since 1950, and is projected to decline to around 4 by 2050. So in developed countries, it is even greater how much they've reduced infant and mortality rates. When you come to child mortality rates, they have both been on the decline in both developed and developing countries. So as you can see, those are just examples of how much the decline has been for the child mortality rates in certain countries. Next, let's talk about life expectancy and longevity. So life expectancy and longevity around the world has increased from 47 years old to around 65. So that was in 1959-55. You could live an average of 47 years. Now in 2000 to 2005, you can expect to live 65 years. And now by 2050, it is expected to increase to 75 years. So this disparity, there is disparity between the developed and developing countries, with developed countries having a life expectancy around 82, and for developing countries to be more or less within 74 years. The aging population is also increasing and is set to overtake the 15 to 24 demographic or age group by 2020. So the total people over the age of 60 is projected to reach around 2 billion by 2050. So that is a very large part of the population. In the developed world, the proportion of people aged 60 and over is projected to increase from 20 to 32% by 2050. In the developing world, it will rise from 8 to 20%. So in other words, you can expect that percent of the population to keep increasing. In the developed world, up to 32%. In the developing world, up to 20%. There's also a slight difference on life expectancy with the genders. So women are expected to live up to 4 to 6 years longer than the males, although there is variation across countries. So as you can see, life expectancy throughout the world is on the rise. Now let's talk about immigration. So when you say immigration, it affects all populations greatly, with over 191 million people living in countries other than that which they were born in. So according to the UN Population Division, the United States will receive the highest number of immigrants. The main source of those immigrants will be China, Mexico, India, Philippines, and Indonesia. So there are three categories. We have the migrants, the refugees, and asylum seekers. Refugees, they are those who are forced to flee their home countries due to safety concerns. Eventually, if those people do not stay in that country, they become asylum seekers. Those are the refugees who wish to remain in the country to which they flee. Migration is often affected by what we call the push and pull factors. So when you say push factors, we could say lack of employment is an example of a push factor. So in other words, if there is no employment in your home country, you could be pushed away from your country to look for work in other countries. You could also say if another country has good work opportunities, that can be a pull factor. In other words, it is pulling you away from your home country. Labor migration mainly includes the flow of less skilled and unskilled laborers, as well as illegal immigrants who live on the margins of the host society. So more or less, labor migration mostly affects those who are less skilled to unskilled workers and illegal immigrants. Traditional push factors include political persecution, economic depression, war, and famine. Pull factors, on the other hand, includes favorable immigration policy, labor shortage, and similar language and culture to that of your home country. So in the United States, they are currently having a immigration crisis where there are many illegal immigrants who are living in the US. So those are some issues on immigration. So unlike other global flows, migration has many restrictions. That is compared to the other flows like trade, information, etc. etc. Many states seek to control migration as it can involve the loss of part of the workforce. The influx of immigrants can lead to conflicts with local residents. So if there are too many immigrants who have very different culture, they can cause unrest in those areas. There are concerns about terrorism, which can affect the state, and the state may desire to restrict migration. Illegal immigration is an issue which many countries face, particularly USA, as there is which is facing a major influx of illegal immigrants from Mexico and other Central American states. To combat this, they are building a fence on the US-Mexico border. Other countries which have similar issues are Great Britain, Switzerland, Greece, as well as countries in Asia. However, class, there is often a statement or a backlash against illegal immigrants or a case for illegal immigrants. What do you mean case for illegal immigrants? In other words, they want the illegal immigrants to become legalized immigrants. So instead of deporting them, they would just legalize those immigrants. Example in this, in the north, when you say north class, those are the developed countries in the northern hemisphere like USA, Canada, Europe, some Japan, etc. The younger force is often constituted of those illegal immigrants because their population is aging already. So remember in demographics, when those populations age, the younger workforce sometimes is outnumbered by the older people. That's why these illegal immigrants, they can constitute a large part of the workforce. They also send remittances back to their home countries, lifting those people or their families out of poverty. This can improve the lives of those recipients, reduce the poverty rate, and increase level of education as well as foreign reserves in the country. So in other words, it's good for everyone involved back in the home country. An example is the Philippines, which is one of the leaders in remittances. We are only next to India and China. India being 24.5 billion, China being 21.1 billion dollars. So imagine those are billions of dollars getting back to the home country via remittances. Due to the increasing amount of immigrants, the term diaspora is being used to describe migrant communities. When you say migrant communities, those are communities of people who are living abroad who have similar culture, let's say the Filipino OFWs. If there are enough Filipino OFWs in a certain place, they can have a sense or create a community there. Diasporization and globalization are closely interconnected, and the expansion of the latter will increase the former. In other words, if there is more globalization, there will be more diasporization. Virtual diasporas are often occurring, and they utilize technology such as internet to maintain the community network. So when you say virtual diaspora, it is a virtual community of immigrants. An example of this is those immigrants working in USA, China. They often create Facebook groups or just use Facebook to communicate with one another. So they can be able to maintain a sense of community. So an example of this, let's say there are groups of Filipinos working in the UK, Middle East, etc., etc. They can create their own groups, so when they experience problems, they can talk to one another to help solve those problems. So there are a lot of things nowadays happening due to the globalization and of immigration. So thank you for listening to my lesson. That will be all, class. Thank you for listening.